G'day, Sean here, and we have two new software updates. The first is for the LCUBE 1, and the second is for the cforce Mini RF. Let's get into it. So we've just launched two new software updates. The first is SUP 3 for the LCUBE 1, which I know has been eagerly anticipated by a lot of you, so thank you for your patience. And the second is SUP 2.1 for the cforce Mini RF. Now, to give you just a brief overview, these two updates now support the ARRI high-speed protocol for the LCUBE 1, and we give you access to the Focusbug license when you're using the LCUBE 1 with the cforce Mini RF. The cforce Mini RF now gets access to the Cinefade license and to ND control when you're using the red camera control license, and it gets encoder mode, and it now works as a radio host with a CAM to L bus cable if you're using it with an Alexa 35. But let's start with the LCUBE. SUP 3.0 for the LCUBE 1 now supports the ARRI high-speed serial protocol, and that serial protocol is up to 12 times faster than the previous one, which is called ARRI Classic or ARRI UDM serial protocol. The Focusbug can take advantage of the high-speed protocol, and this has already been working in the RIA 1 for quite some time, but now it's available to a whole heap of other motor controllers because the update just happens in the LCUBE. Once you've done the update itself, the LCUBE will then detect whether or not it's receiving the ARRI Classic or the ARRI High Speed protocol and adjust automatically. There's nothing that you have to do once you've set the protocol on the Focusbug system itself. Then it will just send out the distance via L-bus to the motor controller. So that means it will work with most of them. For example, if you were using a Alexa Mini and you're connecting a Hi-5 to the internal radio on that Alexa Mini, as long as you add an LCUBE which has the updated software, well then the whole system will also support the ARRI high-speed protocol. Higher speed, well that means more accurate because we're getting more samples per second sent to the display on the Hi-5, which means that you'll be able to react faster to changes in distance from the camera to the subject. And if you're using focus tracking, where we get the Focusbug here to automatically control the focus motor, well that is also going to happen a lot more quickly because it's just operating that much more faster through the whole serial chain and will therefore be more accurate. But there are a couple of things we have to talk about with the LCUBE when it comes to the cforce Mini RF. Now, the LCUBE update by itself just gives the LCUBE the ability to understand the ARRI high-speed protocol. The LCUBE is just a protocol converter, so it accepts the serial commands and then it translates them into L-bus, which is then a language that lots of other devices can understand. So to have access to something like the Focusbug license, which gives you the ability to adjust the Focusbug settings from the Hi-5, the motor controller needs to have an update as well. So we now have two options for being able to adjust the Focusbug settings wirelessly with the Focusbug license. The first is the tried and true RIA 1, which has been out for a little while, and that has this new serial port here. The second is now that you could use the LCUBE 1 in association with a cforce Mini RF, and together both of those devices would give you access to the high-speed protocol and the ability to change Focusbug settings with the cforce Mini RF here. So that has to be updated to 2.1. Let me explain what's going on here. So we have a cforce Mini RF and I'm using that in host mode, which is very important. So I'm using the radio module inside the Mini RF motor, and that's talking to the Hi-5 because I have an EMIT module in my Hi-5. Then I have the CAM port here connected to the camera. So that is a CAM to L-bus connector going into the lens mount, and that configuration in of itself is actually kind of new, and we'll get to that in a second. So that's CAM to L-bus for camera control. It's getting the camera status from the camera and then sending it to the Hi-5, and it's sending back lens data and the Focusbug distance and all that kind of stuff. Then we have a daisy chain of L-bus going from the Mini RF motor into the cforce Mini, and I have that bigger 50 teeth gear here for faster focus pulls. And then I'm connecting the LCUBE also in the daisy chain with another L-bus cable here, and of course that is connected to the Focusbug. Now, it's important to note that you have to have the cforce Mini RF in host mode. That means that you have one of the radio channels selected on the display here, and you're connecting directly from the Hi-5 to the cforce Mini RF's radio. If I was to put the cforce Mini RF into client mode and instead connect to the camera's internal radio, well then I would get access to the high-speed protocol because the LCUBE is here, but I wouldn't get access to the Focusbug license page because I have to be connected to either the cforce Mini RF in host mode or to a Rear 1. There's one other thing to mention, and that is that the Alexa 35 also has the new 4-pin serial port that you will find on the Rear 1. But as of yet, the Alexa 35 doesn't have the software in it to enable support of the Focusbug license features when you're using a Hi-5. It's on the roadmap. We really hope to bring it out soon, but there's no ETA for that just yet. All right, let's look at the other new features with the cforce Mini RF. So some other key updates in SUP 2.1 for the cforce Mini RF. First of all, we now support the Cinefade license when you're using the cforce Mini RF in host mode. And the functionality of that is exactly as is already described in the Tech Talk about Cinefade, which we released a couple of months ago. So now the functionality when you're using either a Rear 1 or a cforce Mini RF will be exactly the same. The second thing is that we have now updated support of red camera control, also with the Mini RF motor in host mode. So that would be, for example, if you wanted to change the ND values on your red camera, either when using one of the END adapter mounts or the internal NDs on a V-Raptor XL, well, that's also now supported from the Hi-5, just like it is with the Rear 1. We've also updated the way that you can connect a cforce Mini RF to a couple of our cameras. So here I'm using a cam to LBus cable. Previously that didn't work. I had to go cam to EXT and then additionally LBus to LBus in order to get both camera control at the back of the camera and lens metadata injection from the motor into the lens mount. Now that's all supported just with cam to LBus from the cforce Mini RF, as long as you also have your Mini LF up to date. The other cool thing is that also means that I can use a cforce Mini RF in host mode with an Alexa 35. Previously that wasn't supported at all, and mainly because the Alexa 35 doesn't have an EXT port, but that does now work. All right, the other nice little thing is that we've introduced encoder mode, and encoder mode came to the cforce Mini in SUP 2, and it now works here as well. So if I go over to my control setup and I turn the slider assignment from iris to off, then I will get a little blinking light up here to indicate that there is no hand unit connected to this motor currently. But as soon as I move the iris ring manually, it will go to green and I get the word encoder up on the display up here. Now that's a little different to the cforce Mini, which turns blue to say that it's in encoder mode, but we thought that it made a little more sense to have encoder written on the display here. The benefit of that is that you can set up the Mini RF or a regular Mini motor just to record the position of lenses which don't have LDS built in. So for example, you might be working with a DP who wants to manually adjust the iris value on the lens, and in that case, without a lens motor on an older lens or one that doesn't have lens data, then you wouldn't get the iris position and therefore you wouldn't get an automatic depth of field readout on the Hi-5. But of course, now you can just slap a motor on and stick it in encoder mode and it will tell you where the position of the lens is. And last but not least, we've introduced a whole bunch of different bug fixes and smaller updates, like CalAll is now supported by the cforce Mini RF in host mode for focus, iris, zoom, and for encoder motors. It won't currently work for auxiliary motors, that CalAll function, but typically auxiliary motors are doing kind of funky functions that you might need to manually calibrate them for. And we've also reduced the time it takes to calibrate the cforce Mini RF motor by reducing the time it takes to go from the end of the calibration back to the position of the knob so that it all lines up again, which is obviously a pretty handy little feature. And last but not least, I've prepared a couple little tips and tricks which you might be interested in. Here we go. All right, I just thought I'd throw in some extra fun tidbits for those keen beans who've made it to the end of the video. The first is that there are now 4 different versions of the serial to Focusbug cable available from Focusbug. That's kind of changed over the years, but if you have a cable that was made since basically Q4 2021, well then it will work with this system and it will support the bidirectional flow of information between Focusbug and the LCUBE. Focusbug themselves will have more information on their website about identifying the cable and making sure you have one that will work with the license integration. Second little tip is that we have noticed that with some particularly older cameras, when you change the protocol in your Focusbug system from either high speed to classic or vice versa, sometimes even though the LCUBE will accept the change and automatically adapt, basically the sending of the serial information from LBus into those older camera systems like an original Alexa Mini, particularly running older firmware, it may cause the data not to be forwarded to the Hi5. So if you're in a situation where you don't get a distance readout from the Focusbug on a Hi5, just power cycle the motor controller and that will usually fix it. Third little tip, I just thought I'd run through kind of very briefly what's happening here with the two LED lights on the cforce Mini RF. The top LED light, well, that's the one that I press and I change the motor axis. So that light will give me the status of the motor. So if it needs to be calibrated or if it's missing the control from a hand unit, for example. And there's a little table in the updated user manual which tells you what all those colors mean. The bottom LED light, well, that's telling us the motor controller status. So when I'm in host mode, like now, I'm on radio channel 12 up here, it's green because it is a motor controller. It is basically what is deciding how the motors turn, and it's accepting the inputs from the Hi5 and adapting them into rotations of the motor. So the motor controller is on and the radio is also in host mode in channel 12. If I change this motor to be in client mode, which is what I would do if I wanted to have a separate motor controller driving the motors, for instance this camera, if I then connect my Hi5 to the internal radio. So now it's in client mode and it's expecting something else to give it commands. And so the light is off at the bottom. The top one is telling me that it has no hand unit connected because it's green and red, and the bottom one is telling me that it's in client mode, and that's a little update in this firmware. The off setting, well, that should be used when you want to have the radio off, but you still want this motor to act as a motor controller. And there aren't that many applications, but they do exist. And the typical one would be if you had a camera inside a housing, an underwater housing. So you can't use radio underwater, but what you could do is have this acting as a motor controller via a hardwired connection. So I can run a long LBus cable between a Hi5 and one of the motors in the chain with this cforce Mini RF, and then the cforce Mini RF would still be acting as a motor controller even though the radio is off. So the fourth little tip is how to change the radio region setting on the cforce Mini RF, and shout out to Ambar B. Kapoor, who also posted about this a couple of weeks ago. So if I hold down the bottom button here, after a couple of seconds, you'll get the firmware version displayed on the display here, which is also super useful. And then it will say region, and I'm in the EU, so it says EU. But I can press the bottom button to cycle through a whole heap of regions. And it's important to make sure that the region that you have set is the one that you live in, because that's where it is legal. And I'm pointing this out because if you're lucky enough to live in the US, then you get access to the highest power or highest radio power of all of the regions. So particularly if you're in the US, you should make sure after a firmware update that you go back in and you reset your region to be in the US so that you're legal and you have access to the most radio power. But I'm just going to quickly set this back to EU. And that's about it for now. So while I do this, I'll say thanks so much for watching. And if you have any questions and comments, you can leave them, of course, in the comments section down below. And I'm breathing a sigh of legal relief here, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.